Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello there. My name is Johnny. I have the opportunity today to interview Pastor John Torres. He is the director of Truth in My Days ministry. Today, we will be starting a series on authorship of the gospel books. I hope this will be useful to you and that you may be able to learn and grow by it. The first question we're going to start then is, does it matter who wrote the gospel books and when?
I'd say most certainly it does. The gospel books, which tell the story of Jesus, his life, his ministry, his miracles, and especially his death and resurrection, are actually the crux of the entire Bible. You've got the entire Old Testament there, which introduces God and the creation of the world, and then introduces the problem of sin, but doesn't solve it. Promises a new covenant in Jeremiah 31, but none appears. It promises a coming Messiah, tells us some things about him, but he doesn't come. So the Old Testament is not complete in and of itself. It's in the New Testament, and specifically the gospel books, that all of these are answered, where the Messiah appears, the new covenant is revealed, and the problem of sin dealt with. The rest of the New Testament then points back to Jesus and explains his work and its ramifications for us, and then finally explains the end of human history. So in light of this, we'd have to see the gospel books as the linchpin of the Bible, which means it's essential for us to know whether or not they are actually reliable, if we can trust what they say, their historicity. And so the authorship and the date of publication of these books is absolutely integral to the question of their trustworthiness. We have to know when they were published.
Okay. I hear this a lot. And in fact, I also hear this from when I went to seminary, is that we don't actually know who wrote the gospel books. I mean, there are speculations and there are some consensus, but it seems to be that the general consensus is that they're anonymous. And the names of the authors were, in fact, added long after the fact. And they were written, quite late, like 35 to 65 years after the events they were supposed to be describing. The well-known New Testament scholar, Dr. Bar Arman, even puts it in this way, and I quote, "How good are the Gospels as historical sources? Unfortunately, they are not as good as we would like. The Gospels were written 35 to 65 years after Jesus' death, not by people who were eyewitnesses, but by people living later. The Gospels were written by highly literate, trained Greek-speaking Christians of the second and third generation. They're not written by Jesus' Aramaic-speaking followers," end quote. Now, is this true?
Well, you certainly do hear this sort of claim almost everywhere you look, whether you're checking Wikipedia or looking at popular magazines like Time and Newsweek and Maclean's, history documentaries on television. Virtually any secular source you would check would repeat these claims. But what you will notice, if you look carefully, is that they never offer anything in the way of real evidence for these claims.
So they're not true?
Absolutely not, on no count.
If that's the case, then we do know who wrote the gospel books and when?
Yes, we do. They were written in order by Matthew, also known as Levi, one of Jesus' apostles, the former tax collector. And the next one then was written by Mark, who was a co-worker of Peter and acted as his agent in writing his gospel book. The third was Luke, who was a Gentile, a physician, and a co-worker of Paul's. He was the only one who was not an eyewitness to the original Jesus, but did base his account on what was delivered to him directly by eyewitnesses. And the third and last was written by the Apostle John, one of the core group of the apostles, and in fact, Jesus' closest personal friend on earth. And that is beyond any sort of reasonable dispute. They were published early. We'll look at that in a future program, but the evidence would put Matthew to about AD 40 or 41, Mark to about 42 to 43, Luke to around AD 48 to 49, which would mean that all three of these books predated Paul's earliest letter, and then John would be probably in the year 64.
Wow, that is certainly very different from what I've heard in the past, and definitely very different from, I guess, the scholarly consensus.
Well, yes, indeed it is. And that's why it's necessary to look at the actual evidence and to go where it leads instead of uncritically following a scholarly consensus.
Can we do that? Go through the evidence?
Sure, but it is a big field, so I suggest we deal with it in what we can call manageable, bite-sized sections. First, looking at how did we arrive at this situation? As how do we get to a situation where there's a scholarly consensus, supposedly, that so dramatically disagrees with what we're saying here? Then we'll look at the problems with the claims they're making. Then we would look at what does the actual evidence say about authorship. And then we'll move on as we get into dates as well. We'll look at what the actual evidence says about the dates of publication. We'll look at what does the actual evidence say about the order in which the gospel books were published. And that might seem like a triviality, but as we'll see, it's actually quite important. And then we'll close off with some observations on the evangelical response to this issue.
Ooh, looks like we got quite a task ahead of us, but it sounds good. I like to learn things in small bites so I can process everything.
Okay, then let's start with how did we get here? The first thing to notice is that the earliest Christians knew who wrote the gospel books and passed that information on. As far back as we go in the writings of the early Christians, the earliest generations of Christians, the church leaders who followed on after the apostles, all agreed that these books were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as we've said. And no one actually challenged this for a good 1,500 years or so. It was accepted. Things didn't really begin to change until we reached that period of history that's been dubbed the Enlightenment. And that goes back into the 17th century, an era in Western society where the growth of scientific investigation and other developments gave rise to a movement of philosophers who began to argue against the supernatural. In France, we're called the philosophes, and they also operated in England, Scotland, other places. And the idea of the Enlightenment to these people was that man is the measure of all things. We don't need God to explain things. It is now in our capability to understand everything about life. Science has the answers. Philosophy provides the rest. There's an influential school of philosophy called rationalism that said that all true knowledge can only come from the rational cogitation of the human mind. And so it frowned on ideas like revelation or holy books. Leading philosophers in the 17th century included people like Descartes and Baruch Spinoza. And then in the 18th century, we had Voltaire, Diderot, David Hume. And the goal, in a nutshell, of these philosophers, of this movement, was to drive God out of society. As we'll see probably in another program, it actually formed the root for the theory of evolution as well, the acceptance of that. There's an interesting quote I came across, and it's from Professor Edward J. Larson. At the time was at the University of Georgia and doing a lecture series called The Theory of Evolution, A History of Controversy, available in the Great Courses. And Larson is perhaps the world's leading expert on the history of the theory of evolution, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author on the subject. And in one of his lectures, he makes this quote. He says, during the Enlightenment, during, say, the 1700s, notions of evolution began creeping back in, that is, creation by natural law. If a people are intent in pushing out God or rejecting divine causation, really the only alternative is where species, well, they could be eternal, as Aristotle said, or they had to come from other species. Where else could they come from? End quote. The noteworthy part there is where he tells us what is the driving force behind the Enlightenment and behind the acceptance of the theory of evolution in general and in specific. If a people are intent in pushing out God, rejecting divine causation, that was the ethos that animated these intellectuals of the Enlightenment era. And this ethos necessitated attacking the Bible. If you're going to reject the idea of revelation and society holds on to the Bible's revelation, you have to attack it. Man is to replace God as the measure of all things. Belief in God, in particular belief in Christianity, had to be attacked. And to do that, they had to discredit the Bible. And so this gave rise to an academic movement that was dubbed historical criticism. Historical criticism can be defined as the study of the available evidence to determine the facts about the historical origins of the books of the Bible. Most important are the questions of who wrote them and who redacted them and when, and how much of it is reliable. And redacting means editing, the idea that the writers were not known. They took earlier sources and perhaps stitched and edited them together into the form we now have. And so that's historical criticism. And it sounds legitimate, but the problem with it is what was smuggled into this definition and that was the idea that there's no supernatural thing possible. We cannot bring God into the equation. So what they were really doing when they're looking at the questions of who wrote the Bible books and when and how, what they were really asking is, assuming they are not divine, assuming God did not inspire them, assuming that any account of something supernatural, a miracle, a resurrection, cannot possibly be true, with all these assumptions, what is the best naturalistic explanation for the Bible? And the field that looked into this is what we call liberal scholarship or liberal theology. Now, what was particularly important to them in terms of discrediting the gospel books, they absolutely had to insist that these could not be eyewitness testimony or even from eyewitness times. If they were, then they have credibility. If people are writing what they saw themselves, it becomes much more difficult for us 17, 18, 1900 years later to say, no, we know better. So it was job one really for them to deny the gospel books eyewitness status. And so it became de rigueur to claim that they were A, anonymous, not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and B, that they were written long after the fact, long after the eyewitnesses were dead. So when did these books written, when were they written according to the liberal scholars? Well, a certain very influential scholar from Tübingen University in Germany, which was the epicenter of liberal theology and historical criticism, a fellow named F.C. Bauer, told us that Matthew was published in the year 130, AD 130. Mark and Luke, somewhere in AD 150 to 160. And John, maybe AD 175 or later. Couldn't possibly be earlier than 160. Long, long after the fact. And you'd wonder, where did these numbers come from? What evidence did Bauer offer for these? Well, he didn't really offer anything. The sum total came down to his argumentation was to say, Christianity must have developed through a battle between the followers of Peter, who taught one thing, and the followers of Paul, who taught another thing. And they had to fight until they reached kind of a consensus view, an accord with each other, a new synthesis that became Christianity we have. And at that point, these books were written, which is not evidence. It's personal speculation. As far as the dates go, where did they come from? Why 130 and onwards? Well, it's just a date of convenience. Assuming Jesus died in the year 30, let's just add 100 years and make sure it's not in eyewitness times. And that's where the 130 came from. None of it came from evidence. And yet it was accepted, just based on scholarly credibility. The scholars say so, we have to accept it. I do remember the German historian Karl Becker famously said that the person who wins the argument is not the one who's right, it's the one who's arguing along with the ethos of society. They were very eager to push God out of society, so they were quite happy to accept these and promote them on nothing more than their authority as scholars. And remember, this was the assured results of critical scholarship. Assured results. John could not have been written before the year AD 160, final period, end of story. And they kept saying that all the way until 1936.
Unfortunately, our time is up for this segment. We will continue to finish next time.
If you enjoy our content and think this is important material, the best compliment you can pay is by sharing this with your friends and family. This helps us out a lot. Also, if you enjoyed today's program, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to this podcast. We would love to hear from you. Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. We would love to hear from you. Please feel free to share any questions or comments you may have. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, MeWe, and YouTube. Simply search Truth in My Days as one word. Again, Truth in My Days as one word, no spaces in between. And you can connect with us. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.